The screech of tires was deafening, cutting through the evening air like a warning siren. Veronica's heart skipped a beat as the squad car barreled toward her, its lights flashing wildly, its sirens blaring in a way that felt too purposeful to be a coincidence. "Get back in the car." Sergeant Clark's voice echoed in the chaos, but Veronica barely heard him. Her focus was on the approaching vehicle, and a sense of dread settled in her stomach. This wasn't right. They had already wronged her, and now, it looked like they were about to make things worse. The car skidded to a halt just inches from where Veronica was standing. The door swung open, and another officer, younger than the others, stepped out, his hand resting too casually on his holstered weapon. His gaze shifted from Clark to Veronica, and then back to Clark, uncertainty clouding his expression. "Sergeant, what's going on here?" the new officer asked, his voice hesitant, clearly caught off guard by the situation. Sergeant Clark's face was a mix of frustration and disbelief. He clearly hadn't expected things to escalate like this, especially not after the conversation he had just had with Veronica. His attempts to calm the situation had failed miserably. "This is getting out of hand," Veronica muttered, her voice cold as she stood her ground. She wasn't about to be intimidated now. Clark took a deep breath and addressed the younger officer, trying to regain control. "Officer Matthews, what the hell are you doing? Why are you approaching her like this?" Matthews, still standing by his squad car, took a few hesitant steps forward. His body language was stiff, his eyes avoiding Veronica's. The arrogance he had exuded earlier had completely dissipated, replaced by the realization that this was a bigger mess than he had bargained for. I don't know what to say, sir," Matthews admitted, his voice shaky. "I didn't know she was." "Enough." Clark cut him off sharply. "I'll handle this." Veronica felt the weight of the situation shift. She wasn't just dealing with an officer who had made a mistake, she was now witnessing the unraveling of an entire department that couldn't handle its own failures. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the systemic racism embedded in law enforcement. "I don't need you to handle this, Sergeant," Veronica said, her voice steady, but laced with authority. "I need you to recognize that what happened here today isn't just a mistake. It's part of a much bigger problem. And I'm not going to let it go." Sergeant Clark's eyes flashed with frustration, but before he could respond, a voice broke through the tension. "Is everything all right here?" It was Officer Jackson, walking toward the group, her expression hard to read. But there was something in her posture that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with what was unfolding. Veronica turned to face her, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm sure you've been briefed, Officer Jackson," she said, her voice sharp. "This incident has gone beyond a mistake. Officer Matthews here has been racially profiling me, and you're standing here watching it happen." Jackson glanced at Matthews, who was now visibly sweating, his body language completely betraying his earlier cocky demeanor. She didn't speak for a long moment, but when she finally did, her voice was softer, almost apologetic. "You're right, Judge. This shouldn't have happened." Veronica's gaze locked onto hers, feeling the weight of the words hang in the air. She had known that Officer Jackson wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. But it wasn't enough. Words were never enough. "I'll need your badge number, officer," Veronica said firmly. "And I'll need this documented. You have no idea what you've put me through today." Clark shifted uneasily, but Matthews, finally breaking the silence, stepped forward. "I'm sorry, Judge," he said quietly, his voice filled with genuine regret. I didn't realize. I didn't know who you were." Veronica's eyes bore into him. "You didn't know who I was, but you still treated me like I was guilty of something. That's the problem, Matthews. You don't have to know who I am. You should have treated me with respect from the beginning, regardless of my background. That's the bare minimum." For a long moment, Matthews didn't speak. His eyes were downcast, and he seemed like he wanted to say something more, but the words didn't come. Veronica took a step back, her hands clasped in front of her. This isn't just about me. This is about every person who's been unfairly targeted and treated like a criminal, simply because of their skin color. This is about the everyday abuse that so many of us have to face. Clark's eyes flickered, and for the first time, Veronica saw a glimpse of self-awareness in his expression. He knew this wasn't just a single incident, it was part of a much larger issue. But as he stood there, trapped between his duty and his conscience, the gravity of the moment was almost too much for him to bear. As the tension reached its peak, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence. Officer Jackson stepped closer, her face serious. "Sergeant, I think it's time we have a full review of this stop. We can't just ignore what happened here." Clark nodded reluctantly, finally acknowledging the weight of the situation. "You're right. I'll take care of it." Veronica turned to face the officers one last time. "Good. Because I'm not letting this slide. Not this time." As she walked back to her car, she could feel the eyes of the officers following her, but this time, they weren't filled with the same arrogance or suspicion. They were filled with something else: regret, guilt, maybe even fear. Fear of the consequences that came from their actions. Fear of the accountability that was finally being demanded of them. But just as Veronica was about to open her car door, a shout rang out. "Wait!" Matthew's voice cracked through the air, and Veronica froze, her hand still on the door handle. She turned around slowly, her eyes locking onto him. Matthews was standing a few feet away, his hands trembling, his face pale. He looked like he wanted to say something, something important, something that might just change the entire course of the situation. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.